All right, let's do it. We're going to start in the NFC South with the Tampa Bay Bucs. They've won 3 straight NFC South championships now, back to back, with Baker Mayfield under center. So the Bucs trying to not just win the division, one of the weaker divisions in the NFL, but figure out a way to kind of get over that hump. Win a couple playoff games and maybe make an even bigger run. Interesting times over in Tampa Bay. Not a ton of turnover, but a couple of your veteran stalwarts over there in Tampa Bay. Chris Godwin, Levante David. David's a free agent again. We'll see if he ends up coming back to the. He's probably back by now already with the Bucs. Who knows? But yeah, let's discuss the Bucs, man. Where do you want to start?
It's funny because you said they're back-to-back champions of that division, and in both years they were not expected to be the division winner. Right, the year before it was the Saints. Everyone expected to win with Derek Carr. Derek Carr is good enough to win you the South. He should be the guy. And then last year, it was everyone expected the Falcons. Kirk Cousins. Cousins is good enough to win you that division immediately. As soon as they signed him, they were propelled into the bookies' favorites for that division. And yet each time it's been Baker Mayfield, the plucky Buccaneers, have found a way to win the division. And okay, once they've made it to the playoffs, they've been, I don't want to say found out or exposed, but that's the level, right? This is a team that was good enough to win the division, but was never really good enough to contend against the true elites. And they've hit that wall. So, is this an offseason where they can find their way past that? Or is that just the sort of level that a Baker Mayfield type of quarterback brings you to?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's setting a good baseline, a good foundation here. Last year at this time, they had to make a decision about bringing back Baker Mayfield and Mike Evans and figure out, are those guys who just got us into the final 8 teams in the NFL? Are they the two that are two of the big pieces that we're going to build around? They locked up Baker Mayfield. They lock up Mike Evans, trying to keep him as a Buck for life, keep that 1,000-yard streak going. And they have similar questions now with Chris Godwin and Levante David. I think the roster's in pretty good shape. They've drafted well. I mentioned interesting times because they do lose assistant GM, or one of the assistant GMs. John Spytek becomes the general manager for the Raiders. He's a scout first type of guy, came up through the scouting ranks, and the Bucs have done a really nice job as far as replenishing talent from within. They've done a nice job as far as drafting and developing their own talent over the last few years. So I think from a needs perspective, they could always use a little bit more from a pass rush perspective. I think they tried to future-proof that with a second rounder in Chris Braswell last year. And, that they probably go back to that well. And they're also a team that seems to match that need with value pretty well in the draft. Remember, a couple of years ago, they drafted Tristan Wirfs with a massive need at right tackle. He stepped right in. They needed a starting safety. They drafted Antoine Winfield. Last year, they needed a starting center. They drafted Graham Barton. So they're picking at number 19. And as I've said for other teams, it does feel like the edge rush, value kind of matches up with the need that the Bucs probably have there.
They've been a little bit like the Dallas Cowboys in recent years, where this is a team that doesn't mind needing to fill a need with their first-round draft pick in particular, right? Like, they're happy enough to go into a draft having picked or having filled most of the holes or the needs on the roster. And if we've got one significant area where we need a player, we're okay targeting that guy with the first-round draft pick. And I think, as long as you continue to hit on those guys, that's fine. That becomes a problem where you miss on a guy, or the guy takes a while to develop, or, it doesn't hit the ground running in the NFL, and suddenly you've got a player that you're actually banking on just sort of taking some time to get to the level that you need him to be at.
Yeah, so I think we'll talk about free agency in a minute, because I don't think they're going to do a ton in free agency. They have a lot of their too deep, or at least their starting group, looking pretty strong. I think they'll have that edge rush value. It mentioned James Pierce's fall a lot on the show. Mike Green. I think, getting one of those guys opposite Yaya Diaby, because it's not just so you have Anthony Nelson as a free agent. Joe Tryon-Shoyinka was the first rounder a couple years ago. He hasn't really panned out. I'd say subpar production. I don't think there's this hidden world where the Bucs love him and want to make sure that they retain him. So I'm expecting a couple replacements there. Braswell, who I mentioned last year. So it's Braswell and Diaby. Just get that pass rush, that elite pass rusher, that Mike Green, that James Pierce in the first round, and then they're working on getting Chris Godwin back here. They're trying to find a way to get him back, and they might be able to steal that hometown discount just to keep Mike Evans, Chris Godwin coming off injury, and a Jalen McMillan together with the speed threat of Trey Palmer. It's a pretty nice, 3-4 punch there as far as receiver goes if they can keep Godwin.
I wonder what Godwin's market's going to be like, because that's a guy that's just battled so many injuries. When he's healthy, I think Chris Godwin is a really, really good wide receiver that can play inside and outside, that makes probably every receiving core in the NFL better. Like, if you got a healthy Chris Godwin, I can't think off the top of my head if there's a single receiving core that he would not upgrade by being on it, say in the top 3 of the depth chart. So if you could get him around, it's obviously a huge thing, but the injuries have been such a big issue now. And such a continual kind of long list of season-ending things that we don't even know where he's going to get to when he's able to come back. So it's curious what his marketplace is going to be like. The other interesting thing is, when this show goes out later today, will be the first of the defensive lineman workouts. So we might not be talking about a James Pierce slide anymore. We might be talking about James Pierce Jr. soaring up draft boards off the back of an absurd 40 time, or leaping out of the building.
Of all the positions, obviously receivers, they can make a move once they run in the 4.2s or 4.3s, but we know defensive linemen, you get the broad, you get the cone, you get that 40 time, you get the 10-yard split. That does help some of those defensive linemen vault, especially some of those big boys, right? The Deion Walkers of the world, the Kenneth Grants of the world. Yeah, we might be hyping them up in the next couple days here. As after you're seeing this. So yeah, I think defensive line depth overall for the Bucs. Drink. How many times have I said that? Add more defensive line depth for you guys. But I think edge does make a lot of sense there. I do think it also makes sense to bring back Godwin. The other need, so to speak, would be the starting left guard position. And that's where Tyler Booker value is also similar. Alabama guard, that is, middle to the late first round is where he's potentially projected. If you do want to get your guard maybe later, I kind of like a guy like Tate Rutledge from Georgia, who's currently in the 80s on the consensus board, which matches up where the Bucs are picking in the 3rd round. So as far as the need and value matching up, I do think this is a pretty good draft for the Bucs to get a good edge rusher, to potentially get that starting guard in round 2 or 3, and fill some of those holes, immediate needs on the roster.
Yeah, and they could be a team that's willing to, again, they've had not a tendency, but they've had a willingness to take these college players or college linemen that were, tackles, and move them inside, that kind of thing. So maybe they would be in the market for another one of those first-round draft picks that they would pitch inside to guard who had been a tackle, whether it's a guy like Banks sliding, or whether it's, one of these other college tackles that they could project inside. That would be a potential option as well for them.
The other spot that we were looking at last year at this time, remember they had Jamel Dean and Carlton Davis as a 1-2 punch for quite a while. Carlton Davis, they traded him. We didn't know what cornerback 2 was going to look like, but you get that breakout year from Zion McCollum. And look, when we talk about the combine, it's relevant right now because the workouts are starting today. Zion McCollum was right there with Tariq Woolen, with that legend. Woolen had the legendary workout, and Zion McCollum was like 1B to his 1A as far as the size, the movement skills, the cone, the 40. I mean, Zion McCollum is a classic athletic, year 3 breakout type, and that's what he did this past year. So I feel pretty good about the cornerback spot with Zion McCollum and Jamel Dean, but you can certainly add a little bit more depth at that position.
I mean, just those 2 guys as 2 data points. I mean, they were 2 not very good college cornerbacks, right? And each one of them was an athletic freak show. Like they were like 2 of the top 10 most athletic cornerbacks that have ever entered the draft, neither one of whom had exceptional college tape or production or performance. And both of whom right now look like pretty good NFL players. Tariq Woolen, obviously, Reek Woolen hit the ground running. It was amazing right out of the gate. McCollum took a little bit more time to get going, but like in a world of like, what do all these things mean, right? What does on-field production at the college level mean? What does athleticism mean? What does the combine mean? Or any of it. These are 2 guys from the same draft class who a lot of things would have said, don't touch those guys. But the absurd athleticism said, let's take a chance on that. And both guys right now look like they're becoming good players.
Yeah, so look, like I said earlier, there's not like a ton of major needs for the Bucs. I think you're trying to look at places where they could upgrade. I think tight end could be a spot. Cade Otton's done some pretty good things. And the Bucs don't have a ton of cap space, but could they be a team that might want to bring in division rival Juwan Johnson, who's been a pretty good pass catching tight end, or a Mike Gesicki? That potentially upgrades the receiving core a little bit, but I don't think they're breaking the bank for any free agents with a little over $5 million of cap space at the moment.
Gesicki would be a really fun option for a few teams. Like, if the more of the big names we expect Cincinnati to finally have to pony up money and keep around, like, the less likely it seems that they're going to try and keep a guy like Mike Gesicki, just because he's going to require some form of, modest, moderate veteran money, as opposed to let's draft a guy and get him for absolute pennies on the dollar. So I think Gesicki has shown that he's a really good receiving tight end. If you need a guy for whom blocking is not a big concern in your offense, bring this guy in. He absolutely turbocharges that kind of big slot move tight end type of position. And, Baker Mayfield can absolutely use a guy like that.
Including, as we've mentioned a few times, the deep tight end draft. So, if you're trying to line up places the Bucs could add either depth or have needs, the pass rusher, guard, tight end, I think it matches up pretty well with where they're drafting, where the depth is in this draft. Only 6 picks at the moment, I think, for Tampa Bay. So fill some of those spots, draft the best players at those areas, and feeling pretty good about where the Bucs are.
Yeah.
Anything else for Tampa Bay here? There's like the bigger picture question of, is this iteration good enough to go win a championship, right? And I don't know that they are. I don't know. Most teams aren't good enough to go win a championship, but you're trying to put yourself in position to at least go on a run. You can at least say that for the Bucs. They can compete for the division once again. Obviously, they've won it a couple times with Baker Mayfield, and then can they go on a run? And I don't see them knocking off maybe the Eagles or the Lions, or who knows, the Commanders at this point, but they're going to be competitive again next year.
Yeah, whether or not they're going to bring back Levante David for yet one more 1-year deal and keep him in the building, and he's still playing amazingly well. Levante David is still a top half linebacker in today's NFL despite his age. Whether or not you're bringing him back, you need to start thinking about a life post Levante David, a linebacker. He would basically be the one high-end player you're comfortable with in that linebacking group. And that's assuming you do bring him back. If you don't bring him back, you basically need to replace an entire linebacker core this offseason. So off-the-ball linebacker is definitely an area where they could be involved. I've seen them linked to Jihad Campbell from Alabama quite a lot at that first-round spot, that number 19 pick. But if you don't take him in the first round, if you go offensive line or defensive line in the first, you can come back second or third round and try and get a linebacker lower on.
I like it, man. I think we've given some options here for the Bucs. They're fixed. We fixed the Bucs.
Nailed it.
We're going to win the division once again.
Thanks for watching all the way to the end of our video.
For more great content, click here to subscribe and here to watch another video. We'll see you again soon.